we go.
All those on your trip.
Tuesday around between 3 and 4.
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
Okay, should we start? Okay. Not this time. We already did that today. All right. Well, welcome back, folks. We're going to be moving on to the second movement. Still, as I said last week, we're going to spend a lot of time with these first two movements because there's a lot to kind of set up. And then from there, we'll move a little more quickly to the Requiem. So we're moving on to the second movement today, the Kyrie. There's a whole lot of history here, and I have tried to trim down here to the essentials, but boy, there's just so much we can talk about. Just let's start off with the text. Of course, that's where we always start with vocal music. This is probably the oldest item in the Christian liturgy, Catholic, Protestant, whatever flavor. This is the oldest text we have that has come down to us. Anyone know how we know that? This is of course, this is in English in the Book of Common Prayer. So I'm sure you have seen it. It is in Greek, yes. It is in early Christian Greek. The only item to come down to us in Greek instead of Latin. And so it's a tripart. It was probably originally part of a litany because it's always performed with a repetitive structure, 3 times 3 times 3. So Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, then Christe eleison, Christe eleison, Christe eleison, then 3 times Kyrie. Symbolic of the Trinity, Trinitarian symbolism there. There it is in Greek. Kyrie eleison is still how you pronounce it in modern Greek, not ancient Greek, but in Christe eleison, the original Greek. This is what it would have sounded like for the first, who knows how long. I mentioned last week, plain chant goes back well before the West started writing it down. So we cannot trace its beginnings, its ancestors. How far does it relate to synagogue worship before that? What are the connections? We don't know. But for over a millennium, this is what you would have heard in church. This is modern notation. That's not what it originally looked like in the 800s when they started writing this down. But anyway, that's what we would have seen, or that's the notation. Repeat that. Often it'll be soloist and then group. They only do it twice. I don't know why in this recording. Anyway, Christe. Listening to this movement, I actually want to point out something to kind of get in our ears and minds before we even, because I want to listen to the whole Introit Kyrie, the whole suite, because he meant for them to be connected. Those of you who are singing it know this. He meant for that to be one big unit. And looking at it for the first time in my life, I mean, I've sung it, I've loved the piece for a long, long time, known it for a long, long time, since high school really, but I've never had a chance to study it, and so it's a really great thing. But I think we have a little window into what's going on here, how he's thinking about this piece. if you listen closely to the instrumentation. So let me play the end of the introit, going into the Kyrie. There's a shift in instrumentation. Now obviously it's mostly vocal focus. It may be hard to hear, but listen closely to what is playing behind the voices. So here's the end of the introit. If you can find it. There's an introit. Let me turn it up. We'll play that in a second, but it ends this way. One instrument. It's one. It's organ, actually.
Oh, wow.
That's why it's such a beautiful big bass sound. It's organ. It's the first entrance of the organ in the piece, in the orchestral version. I didn't notice this before. Let me show you. I'll show you the score. I'll scribble on it. So there's the score, and get it here. So we've got our flutes, our high wind, our oboe. Our English horn, clarinets in B flat, bass clarinet, two bassoons, four horns, trumpets, harp, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Here's our strings, violins, violas, cellos, basses. But it's not until that's the introit. It's not until the Kyrie that you get organ. Organ. Why wait till there? Why that particular moment? Any ideas? Why hold off? Kind of spotlight the organ at that moment. Think about what's the first movement called again? The words are Requiem and Terranum, but what is it?
Introit.
It's an introit. Yeah. It's an introit. Does it suggest anything? And I'm just sort of like theorizing. I don't know. We don't have any evidence for what I was thinking about. An introit originally, in its ancient use, was an entrance, or an entrance song. Okay, it literally is involved with the liturgical action of the clergy and choir entering the church. And so it strikes me that he is thinking almost choreographically about music that leads us into a place, the quintessential space of the choir, assembled choir and clergy, at which point the choir begins to sing a hymn, or a Kyrie, essentially, right? Organ and choir. You don't actually do that. Interesting, harmonically, he does process us in from this minor key to F major, and we're making us ready for the. So musically, he is leading us there, and also kind of from a darkness to this F major. That is rare, by the way, in Western music of all kinds, all genres. Pop, whether you're talking pop, church music, hymns, Beethoven symphonies. You don't begin in one key and end in another. Almost never. There are a few exceptions. Mahler does it. It's so unusual, scholars call it progressive tonality. Tonality, because our sense of the home key is so strong, it's so innate. Whether we study music or not, we all hear it. That we know where that is, and when it shifts. So that's a choice, to end in a different key where it began. So movement in, your cello, and I love how if you listen to how he ends, I mentioned last week, the introit doesn't so much conclude as it kind of the motion kind of dissipates. And there are lots of ways to hear this. So people said a kind of an oceanic, kind of wave-like sound. But also it strikes me that I love the image, which is personal, so it's kind of personal interpretation, of movement in and people like settling. There's movement, people are settling into place, and that kind of calm. Ready for the next moment. So this is that sound again. He's very careful to write rhythms that slowly slow. So you have dee da 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 da. One instrument starts going dee da, another goes dee da da, and then another goes dee da, then ba. And just capture that again. There's something also about the fact that it's reduced. It's almost like just the choir starts singing, just the basses. Begin a hymn or so okay. All right. With that, I want to making that connection. I want to actually go over to a performance, a video of the Berlin Philharmonic. This is not a performance for a church service, but it's a pretty darn wonderful performance. Donald Runnacles, an American conductor, and a Berlin Philharmonic orchestra choir. So here's all of it, whole thing, Introit and Kyrie. What a Kyrie. Just, I don't think you'll find a better one for this particular style, this particular kind of writing. I will let you talk for a minute or two. Sorry, you're like students, but just want to let you decide, what are you hearing, what's reactions, thoughts, just descriptions. Does it strike you to surprise you in any way?
It still has that feeling of motion, like even switching, it's like layering upon layering, and it's still,
Yeah, the layering is key. We'll talk about that in a second. Yeah. You said it still has that. You said motion.
that feeling of motion. You know,
Yeah,
at the very
yes.
beginning, it was like
Yeah.
you said it was like kind of opening the door to something. It's like
Yeah, a particular kind of motion. Yeah, this has its own kind of motion. That's kind of yeah.
But instrumentally too.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, all the brass and whatever.
The brass is really key as well. Yeah. This is church music. Just remember that. And the fact that there's a place for music like this that reaches those sort of heights that can be impassioned, I think that is an articulation. It's just a beautiful thing, a wonderful thing. And I'm glad it's not just happening in concert halls. I'm glad it's happening anywhere I can, but we'll have it in actual service where it was always intended to be. This particular kind of choral writing, I'm going to try to keep this as succinct as I can, but we are hearing something very, very special and very distinctive. And he was a master of this style, which is chicken and egg. It's why he was teaching at the Paris Conservatory at the time. But every student of music, Mike, me, all of us if you have degrees in music, anywhere in the Western world today, and if you study Western music in other parts of the world, you study this technique, or at least the fundamentals of it. And I have to rewind this. What we're hearing is we are hearing 1,000 years of music making in the church, innovated by the church. This was for church music. The church led the way. We're hearing a texture you're probably familiar, you've heard of before, polyphony, polyphonic texture. Get back to my presentation here. There's the store. The church responded to this overwhelming hunger for spirituality in the 12th century as urban life returned to Europe. Sorry, I will give you it's like a history lesson in miniature. But 12th century, there was a resurgence of urban life, and with it the noisy, turdy, ugly, stressful. And so there was a hunger, as I said, for beauty, for spirituality. And the church responded with this Gothic style. New worship experience, the first new architectural style since the ancient Greeks. Basically, the Romans copied the Greeks, and then medieval Christians after them gave us the Romanesque style, which is still basically Greek, copied by the Romans. But this was the first new one, 12th century. And as it was going up, this is Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, as it was going up, there was a new sound as well, a new musical style. I want to take a look at these two paintings, though, and because we're going to talk a little bit about the shift. I want to look at paintings. My dissertation actually compares music and art. I have a minor in art history, and so I looked at High Renaissance polyphony and painting, and was drawing some parallels here. So, medieval depiction of Mary enthroned with Jesus, angels, various Old Testament figures below, and then Leonardo da Vinci. In the lap of her mother Anne, Jesus there and the Lamb. So, just want to talk about some of the differences here. They're huge. But just today, how many differences do we see here between these two approaches?
How many? What? I'm sorry.
Differences, yeah.
Differences.
What are the changes? What's Leonardo doing here that's new?
Nature.
Sorry?
Nature.
Yeah, it's a natural setting. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to tell what this is. I mean, it's a throne, but it's like there's no horizon line. It's just gold. It's like an apparition, like a vision. Yeah. What else? Yeah, and so with that, it's important to place them in we say real spaces. Realism is a human space. Like we feel like we could walk into that. And we're on top of a mountain and that's in the distance. Good. What else?
I think with the music that we just heard, the beginning of the Kyrie would go toward the left-hand side, and the end sounded to me with woodwinds, very pastoral, and it really
Uh-huh.
goes into
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, there are elements of both. Yeah, we'll look at it in a second. There are elements of both in the Kyrie, in the Kyrie, but especially the Kyrie. Yeah. Yeah. Are there like visual differences?
Leonardo is more informal.
Yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well,
Yeah.
the bodies are reaching down and
Mhm.
and very, very formal and regimented on the
There's
left.
an animal in it.
Yeah. Yeah, this is like, and she's dressed in just contemporary Florentine 15th century dress. She looks like any mom. Actually, there's no symbolism here to tell you there's a lamp, but there are no halos. So the question is, how do you know this is divine? And one thing the scholars point out is, as with other Leonardo's paintings, he wants it to be a purely human message or told through very, very human means. Here it's fairly obvious. There's lots of halos, all the divinity, all the halos around angels and all. It's like geometry, perfect divine geometry. This is just a mom looking like any mom reaching for a baby. So that's really, for this painting, one way to look at it is love. Love is what makes it divine, and it really informs everything that's happening here. It's odd that she's not looking at us. Most depictions of Mary, she's presenting Savior of the world here. And that's not what's happening. They're interacting. That's new. Not just with Leonardo, it was kind of a march to Leonardo. There are other Giotto and some other painters before him. But the fact that they are looking at one another and they're also interacting, that's key. It's really, really key. And that you can read, it's a little hard because she was over-cleaned in the 19th century, but used to have modeling like her mother Anne. But you can read like the bend of her head, there's emotion there, this kind of gentle, loving, kind of reaching. She's either picking him up, doing something that mothers do, fathers do a million times. Don't bother the puppy, don't, come here. Or putting him down. Either way, there is gesture here. He's using gesture. And Leonardo was obsessed with human psychology. He had to be sued to finish The Last Supper. It took him months and months and months and months. And some days he would just stand there staring at it. So he had to be sued because he was trying to do something that's, of course, very difficult, and that is to say, how do you paint from the outside so that it looks like it comes from the inside? We know about this, actors know about motivation. You can all read when something looks artificially placed, put in place almost like mannequins, versus something motivates her. She's either saying, oh, come here, picking up or putting down. But this is a composition of gesture. And also interlocking and interdependent gesture. Even the gazes, and they're gazing back at him, she's looking at them. But then if you look closely, there are forms that are echoed throughout this. Let's see, we have this and this, there's this and this and this, posed by that. It's either like mirroring or posing, but it's all related. It's this related kind of web of gesture. How do you tell which is the most important figure in this painting? Obviously, in the center, is anything else that's a little unusual about the proportions of the figures in the painting?
People on the sides and then the men on the bottom.
Well, that's one problem with like naturalism. It's not a natural throne. Like, what is he gazing up at exactly? Like the bottom of what's he seeing? So it's kind of strange. I don't know if that's what you're getting at. But like the proportions are strange. Mary is much bigger than these figures down here. And it is a medieval convention to show the importance of Mary. It's a hierarchical, in other words, again, almost like a symbolic way to show Mary's importance in the painting. So just the size of it. This is two equal human beings. There's just an equal, this web of movement and so. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
Was there more literacy in the 16th century?
You say literacy? In the Renaissance, absolutely, much more. Generally speaking, the monks were the ones, this is a little bit of overstatement, but basically clerics, monks, were the literate ones throughout most of the Middle Ages. Charlemagne slept with a book under his pillow because he always wanted to learn to read. If that gives you any sense of it. And how important the monasteries were to the rebuilding of Europe. Norman Cantor, historian, calls the monastic system was the engine that rebuilt Europe. So literacy, why do you ask? Or why do you...
Because the icons, the windows, all of those things were to help people in a pre-literate society, right?
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So you're thinking on the left there,
On the
the
left,
icon,
they
yes.
knew they had to,
Mhm.
the symbolism was pretty
Mhm.
much all they were going to convey.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. I never thought about that actually, because in a way this takes more interpretation, doesn't it? You know, and it invites interpretation. In other words, it would kind of lead us to this place where we're one interpretation being God is love. In other words, her love makes it divine. We're not even necessarily talking about Mary exactly. So maybe that goes along with it. Whereas they would have known there were conventions. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. What does it have to do with music? Well, for one thing, he is composing in a style that laid the foundation for all the whole expressive language of music for the next 20th century, really. Mostly in art music, but let's take a look at that. So a couple of things here. First of all, this is kind of a little bit of a timeline here for music up to the end of the Renaissance. Okay? And so plain chant, we don't know how far back, but all the way through. In fact, plain chant was sung in Catholic and Protestant all the way into, I mean, there has never been a time when plain chant hasn't been sung somewhere in Christendom. But anyway, it was, and so it would look like this. We just heard some chant. Let's hear this one. You know what happens? My audio switches to something else. So we might have this chant. So, wiederholt, etc. Wiederholt. Choirs started holding those notes, holding each note, so that a soloist, maybe the choirmaster, would improvise another line against it. And eventually they were adding 2, 3, then sometimes 4 additional lines to the top of that. And that's Notre Dame. There were some developments before that led to that, but basically it was made famous there at Notre Dame in the late 1100s as the building was going up. And so what you do is you take each note, you're only going to see the first one, that first has an F, Vida. You're going to elongate it like crazy, and then add parts above it. Let's see if I can make this work. The big shift in the Renaissance was how they were writing these lines, and what we have in the Renaissance is a kind of polyphony called imitative polyphony. Where you take a voice part and you give it a particular tune, a musical idea, and then that's passed around. Rather than having this wall of sound that's moving in ways that are sort of hard to, it's beautiful and kind of has some wonderful mystery, whatever, but it's a little hard to follow. Just kind of all of this sound. Renaissance composers want music to be readable, want us to be able to follow it. And so, all right, let's see if I can make this little animation work here. Let's try that again. Come on, presentation. There we go. So just tenor. Alto, soprano. Bass. yet, boy, what a shift, a gigantic shift in the approach from this. It's real obvious what the important part is. It's the long note. Everything else is moving around it. Hierarchically, they've been added. They're ornamental to the main tune, which is so okay. Kind of similarities there. Any questions about any of that? Okay. All right. So that is the texture. As I said, students spend 4 semesters, most places, learning the fundamentals. It's the same principles lie behind the hymns in our hymn book. The simplest hymns that you just move chord, 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 each part still has to have its independence. In other words, they are not, as beautiful as this is, they are not going, beautiful way to make music. This is a different way to do it. They're not moving in parallel, they're moving interdependently, you know. Okay. All right, so moving on to the Duruflé now. There are examples all throughout history. They're rare, but they do crop up. Both the medieval and the Renaissance techniques, you'll see both of them here. You see this is imitated polyphony, like a round, but with some freedom. Da da dee da da da. Actually turns it upside down. Dee da 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 da. Dee da da da. And then, so that's a Renaissance texture, this interactive web. And then that's a medievalism. That's a tune the congregation would have known. The first note of tune they would have been very familiar with whenever they heard this text. But he's giving it to the oboes. He's giving it to the oboes. We'll hear it in a second. Similar kind of, and if you're with me last spring, we talked about how really against all odds, we do not expect this with Beethoven, but Beethoven is even using this texture. So that all through this tune that he kind of, it's like a pretend hymn tune that he wrote. It's not an actual hymn or a chant. But throughout the texture, and it's imitative, it passes it back and forth. There's this long notes, like it's happening on 2 time scales all throughout the. All right, well, let's get to Duruflé. So let's listen to some of it. I've got a little bit of animation here. Help you follow it a little bit. This is the voices and then the organ reduction. But similar thing. All right, cross your fingers. Here we go. tune, Kyrie, and he's doing the long notes at the same time the choir's doing an imitation. So you have medieval style long notes, Renaissance style imitated polyphony at the same time, all the time. And that's what generates, especially the Renaissance, is what generates all of the motion that builds and builds and builds and builds. And it's kind of amazing. So any questions? We move on to the Christe. All right, things shift in the Christe. Let's just notice what shifts. Okay. Any comment? Anyone saying that? I'm going to go back to the Christe and say a few things. If there are any comments or questions before we move on. Okay. Christe. It is common. You can trace this all the way back to composers finding a contrasting way to set the Christe. And what often happens is composers will write a more austere setting of the Kyrie addressed to God, and a more kind of heartfelt, more impassioned kind of plea for the Kyrie addressed to the human Son of the Trinity. And you get a quick example, the Mozart Mass in C minor. It's not a Requiem, but Mass setting is a Kyrie movement. The opening Kyrie sounds like this. Very kind of a gravity, seriousness. often with a soloist as well. So it's kind of a human acoustic. As you can hear, this Christe rises and rises and rises to the return of the Kyrie, which I could not help waxing poetic, so I'll just read all this to you. It says, let's see. Christe, a very human plea, a passionate cry, rising higher and higher. When we come full circle to the Kyrie, it's becoming impossibly magnified. The bottom drops out from under our feet, and the roof lifts off. It really is like an ocean of sound, and I think one of my favorite, just if I could share this with you, personal little, it's one of my favorite moments in all the literature, is when the choir stops singing. It's one of these, again, like wordless wonder moments. We talked about that in the first movement. That behind the choir, we have the orchestra, and the choir is just sort of caught in, like it's listening along with us. It's very inward. This is very outward reaching. And so the choir, this imitative polyphony and all of its centrifugal forces, magnifying and growing and sending forth this prayer, the choir reaches out. It's like reaching out into the silence or into the room, into the sound, and it gets bigger and bigger. It's like their last breath, and the orchestra carries on, and then they enter back in. It's just a remarkable moment. I'm going to go right to the Kyrie. And one of the things I really think is amazing about this, that increases our sense of magnification of sound. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, just sort of developing into, is that the voices rise and rise and rise, and right at the same time, especially the organ, the orchestra starts dropping, going down and down and down and down and down. So the whole, the outlines of it just keep going. Let's see. Let's go back to it. All right. It is here. This is to hear how it builds up. So Kyrie. And then one final detail before we play. And that is, he does not go Christe, 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 Kyrie, Kyrie. The women, it's what I find amazing, and I think someone mentioned this last week too, is his sense of time, but it also goes along with weight, that there's kind of a momentum that he gets, which is also why the resolutions, he lets them take so long. It's like there's a momentum, slow, strong, big. It's the momentum of a congregation, right, of a big group. It's like landing a jetliner. But in other words, what happens with Christe is the women are building and building and building Christe, and when the basses come in with Kyrie, listen for it, they have one less Kri, and it's just like kind of flinging the sound out, overlapping the return of the Kyrie, and then the orchestra starts here. Okay, so here is the build-up to the last Kyrie. So the orchestra, and of course, have reached way out to the boundaries, limits, and they're back in, and the orchestra continues that, kind of like that in the middle space. Yeah. It's a bright sound, isn't it? All the flute and all that. I think that's what draws my ear.
It's floaty.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, it's like a sound after almost like the release of all of that sound, all of that, the cry. There's just this shimmering light. It's like the orchestra feels a blessing. It's just this wonderfully shimmering. I guess I've already said that sound. It's a quick aside. Stravinsky wrote a piece called Symphony of Songs, and maybe one day we can get together and I'll tell you about it. It is one of the most. It's an amazing, beautiful, wonderful piece of music, and he wrote it after he converted to Orthodox Christianity. And for him, it was a very, very personal thing, not just because he associated with his conversion, from kind of a non-observant Christian. His family grew up sort of nominally Christian. But anyway, but it was also because it was a very personal statement. He chose 3 psalms that had a progression. Lord, hear my plea, hear my cry. And then in the middle, a psalm is, the Lord listened unto my cry, and he heard my cry, and he put a new song in my mouth. And at the end of that movement, there are some sonorities very similar to this. put a new song in my mouth. It ends in this place of almost, okay, I want to say blessedness. I'm sorry if that sounds trite, but it's this beautiful, major key resolution. And then the last movement is a hymn of praise. It's Psalm 150. Praise the Lord on cymbals and the harp and the psaltery and the clashing cymbals and all that. Stravinsky, the modernist, was also a human being. And the story goes that Robert Kraft, his American conductor, who he was very, very close with, they were worked very closely together. Kraft was his assistant. And Robert Kraft tells the story that they were driving home after a concert of one of his rivals, Arnold Schoenberg. And Stravinsky just broke out in tears, started crying. And he said he's always so worried that he would lose his voice as a composer, his muse, or however you want to put it. Lived in constant fear of that. And so Symphony of Psalms is like this plea for a new song, a hymn of praise to God. Now, why do I bring all that up? Because the sonorities in Symphony of Psalms were highly influential, and you can hear some of that here. What that is, I know we just have a few minutes, what that is they call this pandiatonicism, which simply means a musical space in which any notes of the scale can kind of freely cycle through all around. Just up, down, around, all at the same time, and it doesn't come across as, it doesn't sound dissonant. It's tricky to make that happen. But Stravinsky did it first. Aaron Copland took that, and then he gave it a populist bent, and he gave us Appalachian Spring. That sonority at the beginning of Appalachian Spring is a pandiatonic chord. In other words, like notes that don't normally fit, they would be dissonant in a different voicing. If I voiced it differently, have more. But the way so it's that similar kind of like place of just beauty and sort of even the divine. That's what I'm hearing. I think that's going on. I don't have the Symphony of Psalms on my fingertips, but. Questions or comments about Duruflé or?
I almost hear the end of the Kyrie for that sparkling orchestral kind of. Thinking back to how the introit flows right into the Kyrie, I almost see a parallel between the introduction to the introit and the conclusion of the Kyrie. We were talking about how the D minor had its own kind of little sparkle.
Yes, it has movement. Oh, right.
And then the F major at the end of the Kyrie is almost in some way resolving some of that tension, I guess.
It's like steps in the process. Oh, I love it. Absolutely. I totally agree with that. In other words, like the darker kind of movement at the beginning switches to a more at the end of the introit, and then at the end of the Kyrie, it's all major key light. And it's a process of transformation. Totally. Anyway, I like that. There are many parallels between the introit and the Kyrie, like they're almost like they're two halves that are the size of one coin, whatever the thing might be. So,
Especially with what's coming next. This is what we need to hear.
Yes. Yeah, right. It's like we're in place, and what will happen next? Yeah, we'll talk about next week.
Yes, we'll talk about that next week.
Exactly. Anything else? All right, thanks, folks. Thanks for being patient with my animations and whatever.